Okay, hi everybody. Good evening. Welcome. So glad to be back together. We had the privilege of a fun trip last week, so we were out of town and Super Bowl and all that kind of stuff. So welcome. I'm just saying, when you have an evening class and there is no childcare offered, it means you're filtering out your young families, which means, I'm just saying, we have a little bit of a grayer-haired portion of our population on Sunday nights. Okay, so that means I can use illustrations like things from Gilligan's Island and Hogan's Heroes and stuff like that. Okay, yeah, now you're talking. All right, let me find my place here, just get my notes up to where I need them to be. So, the Bible, we've been saying this, but I'm not sure we can really say it enough. Let's kind of like take a little tour through what the Bible says about the Bible. Like, the grass withers, the flowers fall, but the word of the Lord endures forever. Psalm 119 says, "Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path." The Gospel of John opens and says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning, and through him all things were made." Jesus said, "Man doesn't live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." So we have lots of these beautiful pictures of the Scriptures, and Hebrews says the Word of God is living and active, sharper than any double-edged sword. It judges even to dividing soul and spirit, joints and marrow. It judges the thoughts and attitudes of the heart. Right, so we learn this as we begin to get acquainted and get deeper into the Bible, that you feel like you were reading it, but then quickly you start feeling though it's reading you. And I imagine if you're doing the 90-day reading, if this is new and the Bible's all brand new for you, it's particularly, I'm just like particularly thrilled that you're a part of it and you're doing this. I can remember when the Bible was brand new to me and I knew nothing about it, and it was a very, very foreign book and very foreign experience to me. If you are more familiar with the Bible and you've read it quite a bit, I think every time you kind of go back over certain passages that you've read in the past, you see them in a different light, or they speak to you in a different way. Something different's going on in your life, something's changed in you, some perspective, some experience, some reflection, or something different is going on in the world, and you're reading and seeing this all through these new lenses. So what I'm going to do tonight, I recognize that we're not quite in sync with Sunday mornings and with Sunday nights. So for some of you who have certain types of personalities, that's going to be really frustrating for you. So I'm sorry about that. The way we can move through content on Sunday night and the selections that we have to make on Sunday morning, we've got like 15 Sunday mornings, so you cannot get 15 picks. But Sunday night enables us to roam the terrain a little bit more. So tonight what I want to do is I want to move through, kind of get through Kings, Chronicles, and then through Job. Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and so on. So for some of you are like, oh, I'm going backwards. We're going to do a little time travel. But a few comments about sort of the terrain we're in. To be very honest with you, I feel like this stuff is like the hardest to teach. It's history, and it's factual, and there's a lot of really interesting stuff that happens, but it doesn't have as much prophetic or poetic teachable insight, which is kind of where I thrive most, or where I feel most happy and excited in the Scriptures. But I had this thought. Let's just rehearse where God's people have been. Okay, they started in the Garden of Eden, right? That's Adam and Eve. Then after sin, they're expelled from the garden. So you may remember the account, but a guard, an angelic guard, is put on the east gate of the Garden of Eden that does not allow them back into the garden. For a long time when I read that, I thought, that's not very nice. That seems really punitive, that God's not going to let them into the pretty place again. But I've come to see that quite differently, because they had now experienced sin, life apart from God. And if they could re-enter the garden and eat from the tree of life, I think the way the Bible renders the account, then they would have lived eternally in brokenness and sin. So God not allowing them back in the garden is a way to protect them, because living in sin and brokenness has a lot of challenges to it, a lot of difficulties to it. And many of us can attest to a lot of the challenges and difficulties that come with that. So in some respects, if you can go with me, when God is doing his redeeming work and when he makes it clear to us that he will give us eternal life, it'll be relief from this earthly life, but it will be eternal life in a new resurrected experience. This is a massive gift. That, in other words, you don't live eternally in the hardship and the difficulty of the fallen world. And I would tell you, like an account, the first church that I got in ministry in was Third Church. Some of you know it. Used to go by Third Pres when I was there. Wonderful church. It's where I started in ministry. And so being in Richmond still, there are relationships of people that I knew at Third, some of whom I've kept in touch with a bit, others not as much. But one of the people who is someone that, I think we all have people in this life, in this kind of category in life, like you've had a meaningful relationship at a certain time in your life, and you have a real fondness for each other, but for whatever reason, you just don't stay in touch. So anyway, about 2 months ago, the daughter of one of these guys, who's older than I am, but we were in a Bible study for a while at Third, and his daughter called me and told me that he was seriously ill and probably was looking at his last days. So I went to visit him, and he was seriously ill, and he was really, really suffering. And you've probably been with people who have been really suffering. I've been with a lot of people who are really suffering. He was really suffering. And it was hard to see somebody you care about. It'd be hard to see anybody suffer like that, but hard to see somebody you care about. And I was talking to his daughter, who was a complete all-star throughout this whole process, really sharp woman. And I said, Rebecca, there is such a thing as death being relief and being mercy. Your dad has a profound faith. His eternity is secure in Christ. Heaven is his home, and he will be relieved of this pain and hardship. And that will be a relief. And I don't think you should feel guilty about the unusual emotions of relief or even gratitude that his earthly life has come to a conclusion, because his suffering is great. And God has redeemed this and offered us the resurrection. Okay, so that's a rabbit trail about God not letting them back into the Garden of Eden. It's a merciful, graceful protection. It's not a prohibition like, gee, God's being hard with them. Okay, so if you follow the story in Genesis and you get into Abraham, Isaac, you get into Isaac and then Jacob, they get it up into Canaan. They're in Canaan, but then the famine in Canaan happens. Joseph has been sold into slavery by his brothers into Egypt, and they go down to Egypt seeking relief from the famine. So this is a little something like, I don't know that I really noticed before. They were actually up in Canaan. Israel was there. The patriarchs were there. They were in Canaan. But then this famine comes, and they leave Canaan for famine relief as refugees, and they go to Egypt. And then, of course, this miraculous story about how God relieves their suffering because Joseph, their son, who they sold into slavery, is now the right-hand guy to the Pharaoh in Egypt. And then that towering statement where Joseph says, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. So that's what gets them into Egypt. Then Israel, as a sub-people in this larger surrounding population, are there for a long time, and their families are having children, and they're growing. And then the pharaohs of Egypt get concerned. We're going to have this insurrectionist people living among us. They're getting too big, and that's when the whole enslavement situation begins. And then they're in Egypt for 400 years, and then Moses leads them out of Egypt. Then they spend 40 years in the desert, right? So they're wandering in the desert, trying to make their way. Moses had appealed to some of the kings to take the short route up to get into Canaan, and the kings said, you're not coming through our territory. So that's what made them had to go the long way around. So I think it was Golda Meir. I see this is good that we have our older crowd, because I can say Golda Meir, and you're like, yeah, I remember she was the prime minister of Israel like in the 70s. Golda Meir said, Moses led the people of Israel through the entire Middle East, and he settled on the only land that has no oil under it. So Moses brings the people, and of course, Moses, you remember, this is review, of course, Moses doesn't get into the promised land. And he goes up to Mount Nebo, and he can see into the promised land, but he doesn't get in. And then Joshua takes the people into the promised land. Okay, so they go into Canaan. But then we're going to come upon tonight is Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar basically raids Jerusalem and sacks the city and sends the people into exile. Many of them into Babylon, modern-day Iraq, but many of them scattered in a whole bunch of other places too. And if you remember reading it, it said basically he left the most powerless people in Israel, because presumably they wouldn't rebuild something powerful and create a threat. But all the people that had power and strength and so on, he dispersed them. So this is called the exile. So Israel is exiled from their homeland, and we're going to get into some of that. There are other books that are written during the exile. So again, there's this time travel stuff that happens at various times in the Bible. Like Lamentations is written during the exile. It's about the lament that the people of Israel feel, that they feel far from their homeland, far from God, and they feel completely in exile. Okay. So then Nehemiah is going to be the one who begins to help rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and help them get back there. Okay? So that's a long way to say, here's the geography. The Garden of Eden, Canaan, Egypt, the desert, Canaan again, Babylon, and then return to Israel. Okay, so this is how the people are moving along. Remember a few weeks ago, I'll review to catch up because we were off for a week, but you're seeing the development of a people, their nationhood, their religion, their laws, and their relationship with God. This is all part of what we're moving through. Right, so it's a little bit of kind of why it's hard to teach. Some of it's not that thrilling. It's, Chronicles kind of stuff. But it's important. Like we're seeing all through here, this is the formation of the people of Israel, who God calls his beloved children. And they are forming and growing and maturing as a nation, as people in their religion, and people in their laws, and all that kind of stuff. You've seen that. But I think sometimes it's easy to read through it all and read all of laws and all this kind of stuff that's going on. You're like, what is going on here? That's the forest. The trees is the formation of a people who God will call his own people. Okay. So I'm going to try to hit on some highlights. We have folks who are in the booth who are helping pull these verses up. We were going to try to use the screen up here, and we had some ideas about the way we're going to use that, and it didn't really work out the way we wanted, so hopefully this works better. Okay, significant scenarios. Now we're in Samuel. I'm just going to mention from Samuel 6. David brings the ark. 2 Samuel 6, David brings the ark to Jerusalem. This is a big moment, okay? The people are beginning to clarify that Jerusalem is their home base, their home city. It's the seat of their personhood, their nationhood. And David brings the ark up to Jerusalem. Okay? So let me just read it to you. King David was told, the Lord's blessed the household of Obed-Edom. Obed-Edom was a guy where they left the ark at his house while they were transporting it up to Jerusalem. And everything he has because of the ark of God. So David went to bring up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. City of David is Jerusalem, also called the city of palms. When those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. Wearing a linen ephod, that's what the priests wore. Wearing a linen ephod, David was dancing before the Lord with all his might. I love this scene. And while he and all Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sound of trumpets, as the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David. Okay, you got to try, if you can, to like close your eyes and imagine being there. It's a massive triumphal moment. They're bringing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. This is combining their nationhood, their religion, and their settling in Jerusalem. It's a huge moment, kind of like a coronation, but something a little bit different than that. Okay, as the Ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window, and when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. It's a little bit of a mysterious story. They brought the ark of the Lord and they set it in the place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. Okay, so there's no temple in Jerusalem yet. It's a tent, but Jerusalem is being established as Israel's place. And David, who's been serving God as this king, this great king, who, as we've said, is a remarkable person. David is a remarkable warrior. He's a battlefield guy, no doubt about it. He's quite the artist. I mean, he plays the harp. He writes music. He writes poetry. Many of the Psalms are written by David. Like really a Renaissance kind of guy. Okay? And yes, he's a guy who sins and he does the wrong thing. There's no doubt about that. And we shouldn't gloss over it. But nonetheless, God calls him a man after his own heart. So David brings the ark up to Jerusalem, and this is a big moment. Michal is his wife, who was Saul's daughter, and when she sees him doing this, like David's dancing with all his might. I'm not sure what that means or exactly what that looks like, but he's like this king, and he's celebrating, and he's dancing with all his might before the ark in this triumphal procession, bringing the ark up into Jerusalem, and she despises him in his heart. Not much more is said about that. She does lecture him afterward. And she basically says, look at you like a fool dancing in front of all the maidens of Jerusalem. So is she worried that he's going to catch their eye? Is she thinking, this is my husband, he's acting like an idiot? I don't know. She is Saul's daughter. And remember, David and Saul's relationship was very scratchy and strange. And so we don't really get the full story on why Michal despises him in her heart. But for whatever reason, she didn't dig the idea that the king was dancing before the ark with all his might. David brings the ark up to Jerusalem. It's a huge moment. Okay, next we're going to get into Solomon builds the temple. Okay, so you remember Solomon is David's son. He's the king. After David died, the transfer of power didn't go so well. And when we read through the book of Kings, you see this over and over again. And it's actually an interesting historical study. A lot of history will tell you when there is a change in power, a country is vulnerable. Until this change of power happens clearly and effectively and well, it's a vulnerable time. And in these days, you had all kinds of people vying for the throne. In our scenario, it's a little bit different, but we've all seen, even in recent times, it can be very vulnerable when there's a change in power. Okay. So when David dies, his sons are battling to get the throne, and it's a mess. And then Solomon goes to his mother and says, Mom, Dad said I was going to be king. And she basically goes and talks to him and said, hey, you know, the boys are arguing over the throne, but you did tell Solomon he's going to be king. So David complies with Bathsheba and ensures that Solomon's going to be king. And Solomon then builds the temple. Okay, so 1 Kings 6:1. In the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord. Okay, it's a big deal. The temple is going to be the earthly representation of the presence of God. This God, the God who created everything, God who we know as the Father of Jesus Christ, God who has set his heart on Israel, this temple is going to be his dwelling place. But he told David, you're not going to build the temple. Solomon's going to build the temple. And we'll get back to that in a little bit when we get to Chronicles. It gives us more telling of this. Solomon builds the temple, takes 7 years to build the temple, right? We mentioned this. And then he builds his palace, takes 13 years to build his palace. So his priorities seem to be a bit askew. But I think before we dismiss that with humor, we would do well to kind of ask about our own lives in this regard. Like, what do we do with our money, or what do we do with our efforts, what do we do with our energy relative to trying to serve God and glorify God, or kind of spend it on myself? And I'm just saying, I think the story invites us to examine our hearts on this kind of a question. Okay, so Solomon builds the temple. All right, those are big historic moments. That's why I'm mentioning them. So the temple is built over a period of 7 years. It's grand, it's remarkable, it's beautiful, it's laden with gold, and you can read about all of the very, very specific words about exactly how it's supposed to be built. And all these measurements, they transfer. I think I mentioned this. Like a cubit is about 18 inches. But, all of these measurements, they're made because people aren't carrying measuring tapes around. A cubit was generally from your elbow to the end of your middle finger. Okay? The average distance of a man's elbow to his middle finger. So 18 inches ballpark. So that's what a cubit was. So when you read about the cubits, and it says it was this number of cubits, a cubit's about 18 inches, about 1.5 feet. You can do all that translating, and you can get very accurate renderings. And you can go on the internet and Google pictures and CAD designs of what the temple looks like. It's a pretty cool journey if you want to do that. So Solomon builds the temple. All right, let's skip to Elijah. This gets fun because I like Elijah. All right, 1 Kings chapter 18. You remember Ahab is king of Israel now, and Ahab is not a good guy. And when we're reading about the kings, you remember, right? This king was good, and he served God, and he honored him. This king was bad, and he gave his heart to the Baals and the Ashtoreths. This king was good, but he didn't get rid of the high places. This king was bad. He gave his heart. So I don't know how closely you've been paying attention, but just repeating, the Baals and the Ashtoreths, these gods like Chemosh and Molech, these are bad, like dark, evil religious practices. And they were the religious practices of the people that surrounded Israel and that had lived in Canaan. And I've mentioned this, so I don't have to do it again, but the religious practices are bad and gruesome. And yet the people of Israel were tempted to syncretize their religion with the culture around them. So we're going to do a little of what God teaches us, but just to be friendly with the natives, we're going to do a little of what they do, so they kind of like us, so we can try to put our foot in both camps and justify ourselves to either side. And this is going to become a problem. So Elijah, this great moment on Mount Carmel, Elijah and the prophets of Baal. I wanted to read the whole story, but it's about a whole chapter, and it would take quite a while. But here's the gist of it. Elijah challenges Ahab, who has acquiesced to Baal worship, and he says, bring out all your priests of Baal, and let's meet on Mount Carmel. It's kind of like religious showdown at the OK Corral. It's really cool. All right, so Ahab sent word throughout all of Israel, 1 Kings 18, 20, 21, and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. Elijah went before the people. He went before the Jewish people, the people of Israel, and he said to them, how long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is God, follow him. But the people said nothing. So what he's doing, he's an in-your-face prophet, and he's confronting them, and he's saying, you're going to do both sides of this? You're going to walk both sides of the aisle? You're going to live with one foot in both camps? You know that God's heart for you is loyal and true, and his relational heart is that you would be loyal and true to him. But basically what you're doing is committing religious infidelity because you're giving some of your heart to God, but you're also giving it to these other gods. It's like spiritual adultery. And Elijah is one of these guys who sees it for what it is. This morning I talked about prophets. They're truth tellers in the name of God, which means they're often unpopular. And so he basically says to the people of Israel, you want to serve God or do you want to serve the Baals? You make the choice. And they say nothing, right? I don't even know if they got that part out. They say nothing, which I think is what we do sometimes when we're really confronted with a difficult challenge and situation. It's interesting that Elijah is described as a guy who wears basically a belt and goat hair. And so, of course, it makes you think of John the Baptist immediately. And I think these guys are I gotta say it, cut from the same cloth. I mean, they just like, they're so much alike. And they both get themselves in trouble because they are unrelenting truth tellers. And John the Baptist, of course, has, Herod cut his head off because John the Baptist will not relent to confront Herod with the truth of what he's done. We'll get there later if you're not familiar with that. So Elijah has the prophets of Baal come up, and they basically go through this experience where they say, let's put cows on the altars, and then we're going to pray, and I'm going to ask God to send fire down, and this will be your cow altar, and this will be God's cow altar, and we'll see which one he consumes with fire, okay? So he tells the people, go ahead and put your cow on the altar, and go ahead and do what you do to ask Baal to, consume the offering with fire, and nothing happens. And Elijah's baiting them. He's like, maybe you should try calling him louder. Maybe he can't hear you. And then nothing's happening. And I'm thinking, dude, this is risky. Because if this thing doesn't work out in a few minutes when you turn the table, this is going to be a tough show here. So then they're like louder and louder, and they're kind of chanting and all this kind of stuff, and nothing's happening. And he's like, maybe he's on vacation. Maybe your God's on vacation, right? It's like he's very in your face. Nothing happens. All right, so then it's like, all right, my turn. We'll see which gods are really God. So put the bull on the altar, and he says, hey, just to really prove it, let's douse it with water. Completely make it non-burnable. Let's just make the point. And they douse it with water, and then Elijah calls for God to send fire down, and he does. And so the bull is consumed on the altar. And Elijah is trying to say, let's get clear about who God is, and let's stop fiddling around with these false gods that are popular with the surrounding people. It's a towering story. It's really cool. You can read the whole section. I would say if you want to read the whole section, it's 1 Kings 18 through 40. Okay, but this is an important question. The reason I'm trying to hit these big ideas, Israel trying to be faithful to God, living with these surrounding religions and beliefs, is a trial and tribulation for them the whole time. And I've been saying this, but I don't know that it can be overemphasized. It's the same basic challenge for the church. How does the church, people that wish to say, God, we love you and honor you, stay faithful to him in a surrounding culture that doesn't embrace the beliefs that the church believes, doesn't embrace the God that we say is the authority? How do you do that? If you do it, you're going to get criticism. Because the larger population, the surrounding culture, is not going to agree with a lot of the points that the church holds to. So for the church to do this, I think one of the things that we have to do is we have to develop a deeper theology of understanding why we believe this, right? And we can talk more about this as the weeks go on. But particularly as the church and the culture in the United States move farther apart from each other, what we believe, I think the church, it's not going to be easy to be kind of a fat, lazy Christian anymore. You're going to want to know what you believe and why. And I think that's wonderful. I think it's exciting. I think it's an invitation to the church. And very honestly, it's one of the reasons why I really wanted to lead us through this 90-day Bible experience. I'm not a person who says, the church is in for horrible persecution. I don't necessarily agree with that in the coming time. But I do think the church will find less cultural acceptance. So you're going to want to know, what do you believe and why do you believe it? And do I have reasons why I believe this as a good and beautiful thing? And that's a journey for us. And we'll talk more about that as the weeks go by. Okay. So 2 Kings 8:19. This is one place where, wait, let me see here. Yeah, 2 Kings 8:19. Have I got that right, Rachel? My notes are different than what do you have 2 Kings 8:19? Oh, I see where I made a mistake. I was cutting and pasting stuff into this, and I duped 1 Kings 18. 2 Kings 8:19. This is called the Davidic covenant. Nevertheless, for the sake of his servant David, the Lord was not willing to destroy Judah. He had promised to maintain a lamp for David and his descendants forever. Okay, this is a very important promise to the people of Israel. And the promise is that a king in the line of David that lineage of David will continue on through the generations for the kingship of Israel. Okay, and that becomes important because when Jesus is born, you read in Matthew, that genealogy is tracing him back to David. And this is an affirmation of God's promise to the people of Israel that David, who has been our first good king, will have a descendant on the throne throughout history. It's called the Davidic covenant. Okay? But it's an important thing to understand. It's a thread that runs through the Old Testament. And when we get to the birth of Jesus, it's really important because Matthew traces Jesus' lineage to David. And that's really important for Jesus to be the king of Israel. Right? You get that? It's really important. All right. Moving along, I'm just going to mention Josiah. 2 Kings 23:13. And then we could go on a little bit further. But basically, Josiah is one of the good kings. And he's more good. He's gooder than a lot of the other ones. And so he institutes the Passover. That's a big moment. Israel had jettisoned the Passover, hadn't been practicing the Passover for as long as anybody can remember. Josiah, they find the book of the law, and Josiah brings out the book of the law, and he has it read before all the people, and he reinstitutes the Passover. So now Israel is coalescing again around some of these very important centerpieces of their faith identity. And Josiah is the one who brings that about. When we talk about the law, I think you know this, but the word law on American ears, I think, can land quite scratchily. It's against the law, or you broke the law, or you got pulled over for speeding and, by an officer of the law, whatever. But when a Jewish person hears the word law, like when they say God's law is precious, they're seeing it as his instructions for living. And the reason the Jewish people are so constantly saying his law is precious is because he's teaching them how to live in a very, very confusing human existence. And I think we can all say sometimes, yeah, human existence can be very, very confusing. Can anybody show me how to do it? And the law is God's instructions to his people Israel how to do it. How to do it so that there is human flourishing. How to do it so that there's human dignity. How to do it so that God's glory and his nature is upheld. And this is how he gives his instructions to us. Essentially conveying to live apart from that truth is going to create confusion, distortion, indignity, disillusionment, and so on. And I think in our culture we have a lot of that. Okay, so we have opportunities to think about that. But I think in our culture, there's a lot of hardship and probably more disillusionment, distortion, depression, and anxiety than I can remember in my lifetime. And I sense the earliest breezes blowing that there are people beginning to say, this is wearing me out. Does anybody know another way to live? And I think it's a beautiful opportunity for the church. Paul's description of this is to shine like stars in the universe. The church has an opportunity to say, here is a God who loves you. Here is a God who redeems you. Here is a God who forgives you. Here is a God who shows you how to live. Here's where you will find your identity that you've been longing for but struggling through in all the cultural wastelands. Here is the way to find purpose and foundation and the love that your heart and your soul long for. Here is this God. And I think and I hope that we may be on the front end of more and more people. They may not actually ask it, but their hearts and souls are asking it. Can anybody show me another way to live? Because this is wearing me out. The depression, the distortions, the isolation, the loneliness, the pain. These are the pandemics in our culture. So Josiah is bringing a restoration to the people of Israel, and he's bringing them back to their faith center. Okay, so now you've got the ark brought up to Jerusalem. Now you've got the temple in Jerusalem. You've got the ark is put in the Holy of Holies of the temple. So you may know that the temple, it had outer courts, inner courts, and then you rise up to enter the temple, and you go into the temple courts. But then the Holy of Holies is the place that is most set apart. It's the place where the ark is. It's the place where the presence of God is understood. And only the priests could go in the Holy of Holies. So you have these outer courts, and then you have the court of the Gentiles. That is, a Gentile is a non-Jew. But there were a lot of Gentiles who had become Jews. They converted. But they weren't bloodline Jews, so they weren't allowed into the temple in the same way the Jews were. So there was a court of the Gentiles, so they could come close, but not that close. There was also a court for women, because the gender issues were such that it was a very patriarchal society. So men could come closer, women could come sort of, but not that close. And then you get into, in other words, you get the point. The closer you get into the temple, the deeper in you go, the more you're going into the holy place. All right. Then we get 2 Kings 24:8 through 25:10. Nope, let me do a shorter version. 2 Kings 24:10 through 14. At that time, the officers of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, advanced on Jerusalem and laid siege to it. And Nebuchadnezzar himself came up to the city while his officers were besieging it. Okay, so this is Babylon now laying siege to Jerusalem. So I think you remember that what is called a city, it's not a city like we think of a city. A city might have maybe as many as 20,000 people in it. A very compact, concentrated gathering of homes and places where people lived and markets and all that kind of stuff. And the cities were almost always surrounded by walls to protect them. Most all the cities were walled cities. So Jerusalem is a walled city. And now it has become the seat of Israel's placement and identity. And the surrounding nations are beginning to see Israel growing in power and prominence and position. And Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, modern-day Iraq, and other kings around, but Babylon's the strongest, and so Nebuchadnezzar advances on Jerusalem to sack it. And what they do is they lay siege, which basically means they basically make a big army circle around the city, and they let nothing in and nothing out. So it's a starvation thing. We're just going to wait it out, and we're just going to wait till you starve. You don't have any water, you don't have any food, and you can't make it. You can't get out to your crops, and you have no food or water supply. We're just going to wait it out. And these sieges would go on for a long time. And you'll see how this one plays out, because the people in Israel do begin to run out of food and resources. Interestingly, in some of the cities, they would build underground tunnels that would go under the walls, and they would go underground to a secret water source. Like there might be a well that was 100 yards outside the city, and some of these cities would dig these tunnels that would go down to these secret wells that were subterranean wells. And so the idea was people could go down below the city walls in the tunnel to the water source and provide water by coming back in the city. And nobody on the outside would ever see or know that they were doing that. Okay, so Nebuchadnezzar lays siege to Jerusalem, and then, long story short, he sacks Jerusalem. Okay, so that's like that's a lot. That's kings, that's what's happened with David and Solomon and the establishment of Jerusalem. But then Nebuchadnezzar comes and sacks Jerusalem. All right, then we get into Chronicles. Chronicles is, as I've said about a number of things, it's a retelling. So if you're reading Chronicles and you're like, I just read this in Kings, you're right, you did. But in an oral culture, it's telling and retelling and telling and retelling and telling and retelling. And sometimes you tell it from this perspective, and then other times you tell it from this perspective. And somebody tells the narrow lens, and somebody tells the big picture. And that's kind of what's happening when you get Kings and Chronicles. Chronicles is telling broad sweep stuff. Okay, so it's retelling Israel's history. All right, so I'm going to go through a couple of little lines here. One of them is it says, Solomon will build my temple because Solomon's a man of peace and David was a man of war. That shows up in 1 Chronicles 22, 9 and 10. Interesting little sidelight that God says Solomon's going to build a temple, not David. Solomon's a man of peace, and so he'll build a temple, not David. David's a man of war. Jerusalem, you may know, Salem means peace. So one way to translate Jerusalem is city of peace, and it's struggled to be that, of course, through its history, which is part of its long history and story. Okay, 2 Chronicles 3:1, another little detail. God tells Solomon to build the temple on Mount Moriah. Okay, now we're time traveling. We're going back again. Because, right, you're like, wait, didn't you just say the temple was already built? I did, but now we're going Chronicles backward again. This is a retelling of the story, and it's coming up with some details that we didn't get beforehand. So God tells Solomon to build the temple of the Lord on Mount Moriah. Okay, and I've mentioned this a lot, but I just think this is one of the most remarkable things in the whole Bible. In Genesis 22, back with Isaac and Abraham and Isaac, this is where God says to Abraham, then God said, take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I'll show you. So that mountain where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac is Mount Moriah. It is Jerusalem, and it is where God tells Solomon to build the temple, same exact place. If you could time travel about these locations in and around Jerusalem, just remarkable how we see God working in these places. All right, 2 Chronicles 5, we get to the dedication of the temple. Okay, it's a big deal. It's huge. It's a worship experience. It's trumpets. It's sacrificing animals. In 2 Chronicles 5, it says there were so many animals and sheep and cows that were sacrificed, you couldn't count them all. But in another place, it says it was 22,000 cattle and 120,000 sheep. You're like, hey, that doesn't get your attention. 120,000 sheep are sacrificed at the temple and 22,000 cattle. Okay? Chronicles, again, a different lens, takes us through the history of Israel, and then we get on to Nehemiah. Okay? Time travel again, because Artaxerxes is the king of Babylon, and Nehemiah is his cupbearer. Nehemiah was a Jew who was taken to Babylon in the exile when Jerusalem was sacked by Nebuchadnezzar. So now the king in Babylon is no longer Nebuchadnezzar, it's Artaxerxes. So Nehemiah finds himself in this position. It's really interesting how the Jewish people end up finding themselves in these important positions in these foreign governments. And I don't know what the storyline is there, but it's really interesting. It happens a lot. So Nehemiah is the cupbearer to Artaxerxes, right? You may or may not know what a cupbearer is. I still have enough little boy in me that I love adventure stories, and I think some of these little details are really cool. A cupbearer was somebody who tasted whatever the king was going to drink before he drank it to ensure that it wasn't poisoned, right? So a king would never eat anything. A king would never just have a plate of food and a cup put down in front of him and just eat it. Because all the time, these kings' lives were at risk from people that wanted to overthrow them, kill them, assassinate them, and get rid of them. And poisoning was a very, very frequent way that you would get rid of a king. And so a king would never just sit down and eat what was put in front of him. The cupbearer, it's called a cupbearer, but it's also going to be the food taster, right? He's going to take a piece of his meat and eat it, and then he's going to take a drink from his cup and drink it, and they'll wait about 10 minutes and see how it goes for the cupbearer. And if the cupbearer goes belly up, then the king is not eating tonight. Or at least he's going to have a conversation with the chef about who got in between them or whether the chef did it himself. So Nehemiah is the cupbearer to the king. It was an important position. It was really, as you could imagine, a very significant security detail type of job. All right. Nehemiah is in this trusted position with Artaxerxes. And so one night he's there to be the cupbearer, and Artaxerxes is like, why are you so down? Well, Nehemiah had just gotten word about the state of Jerusalem it's just decrepit, falling apart. And he's Jewish, and he's deeply saddened by it. So in Nehemiah 2, then I said to them, you see the trouble we're in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem. We'll no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. He had appealed to Nebuchadnezzar to let him go to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And so when he gets back to Jerusalem and he sees the condition of it, like all falling apart and in disrepair, he's grieved about it. So Nehemiah begins to be the one who starts the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. Again, it's a big moment historically because Jerusalem was in ruins. And only the most powerless people lived around it. So nobody really had the resources, the strength, the economic power to do anything about it. It needs somebody to come and try to help it. And Nehemiah talks to Artaxerxes, right? And he has to be trusted, right? Because I don't think you could go to Artaxerxes and say, hey, remember your guy Nebuchadnezzar? He sacked Jerusalem and it's all in a heap. Well, those are my people and I'd like to go rebuild it. I think Artaxerxes would say, forget about it. Like, we took it and it belongs to us. So these relationships are really important. And so Artaxerxes gives him permission to go rebuild the walls. All right, now we get to Esther. Esther is such an awesome story. And I have very high regard for a whole bunch of really brave women in the Bible. There are numerous occasions in the Bible where it's women who stand in the crosshairs of danger, and they do it with remarkable courage, and God uses them in incredible ways for redemptive purposes, and Esther is one of those stories. Okay, so I don't need to tell you about the whole book of Esther, but this too is a little bit like, Princess Bride kind of stuff. And Esther is a Jewish, we're back in Babylon. The Jews are in exile captivity in Babylon. And so the king says he wants to see his wife, and the wife says, And so the king's like, get rid of her, dump her, and find me another wife. And so the king says, go find me, one of the most beautiful women in Babylon. And he sends his scouts out to go find him one of the most beautiful women in Babylon. It's interesting, you read about it. It's like, so they gather like a whole bunch of women and they give them like beauty treatments and special food and all kinds of stuff for a while so that when they're presented to the king, presumably they're looking their best. So anyway, Esther is the one the king picks. But Esther's a Jewish woman and she's one of the exiles. And so here you have the king and he says, I'm choosing Esther to be my new wife. So once again, you have a Jewish person in a remarkable position of relational positioning at an incredible crucible moment. Because Haman is one of the guys in Babylon, and Haman is just dark and evil, and basically a sort of an insecure, fearful guy who turns that into darkness and evil. And basically he hatches a plan to have all the Jews killed. Mordecai overhears this plan. Mordecai is Esther's uncle, who is also a Jew, who's in Babylon in the exile, and he hears about Haman's plan to kill all the Jews. And Haman is in the cabinet of the king. And so Mordecai calls Esther, his niece, who is now the wife of the king, and he says, hey, you need to know that this guy who's in the king's cabinet is hatching a plan to have all the Jewish people killed in Babylon. And a woman had no power in that day. And for a woman to try to appeal to the king against his will would have been really, really risky. On a good day, he would have said, thanks for the suggestion, but no thank you. On a bad day, he would have executed her for challenging him. So Mordecai says to Esther, I think you need to talk to the king about this or all our people are going to be wiped out. It's full of drama and tense moments. And Esther, I'm paraphrasing, it's kind of like, I don't really want to do that. And he says, you got to do that. And she says, I don't want to do that. And then, of course, we get to this great moment where we get to Esther in chapter 4, verse 14. Mordecai speaking to his niece, Esther, beautiful woman, married to the king, Jewish exile, in this position of relationship with the king. He says, if you remain silent at this time, Relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you've come to your royal position for such a time as this. One of the great lines of the whole Bible. I mean, just incredible. Who knows but that you come to your royal position for such a time as this. So Mordecai's like, look, I don't think this happens by accident. And this is one of these things that goes back to the Jewish people finding themselves in positions of political power with relational ins with people who were very hard to have that kind of access and power with. Okay. So Esther says, you go tell everybody to pray for me for 3 days straight, and I'll think about it. And basically she does. Okay, but she appears before the king uninvited. Okay, remember, kings are always afraid of getting knocked off. Nobody shows up in the king's presence uninvited. If you show up and surprise the king, it's off with your head. I mean, just like that, because you're considered a threat. And people are trying to kill kings all the time. So you do not just like walk in the king's bedroom and say, hey, how are you doing? You don't do it. You get killed for doing that. So when Mordecai says to Esther, you need to go talk to the king, she's like, I don't have permission to go talk to the king. He's like, well, you got to risk it. She's like, And he says, I'm telling you, and she's his niece. I'm telling you, you need to do this. So that's a tough position she's in, right? She got her uncle, got the Jewish people on her shoulders, and she got the risk of off with her head if she surprises the king. Well, if you want to know what happens, read the rest of Esther. Okay. The way the twists and turns in the plot of Esther, it's like, it's incredible. So go ahead and read it. All right. I want to finish by talking about Job for a few minutes. I spoke about Job 2 weeks ago in my sermon. I think Job is a massive book in its significance. And I think a lot of us kind of resist it because we don't like reading about suffering and we hope it doesn't happen to us. And suffering is of course, remarkably hard. I think somehow we've got this thing in us that sort of thinks if we get too close to it, maybe it's contagious. So if we don't read about it, at least maybe that'll keep it away from us. I don't want to read about suffering because it might happen to me. I have no explanation for that. I just think it's our psyche and our fears. But the story of Job is remarkable. And so let me just pull out a few what I think are significant points. In Job 4:6, Job's got these friends who are jerks. And they're three guys who are ramping up their religious, self-righteous formulas to Job, basically saying, God's punishing you for something. You must have done something wrong. This wouldn't happen to you unless you'd done something wrong. God's punishing you for something. And Job is saying, I have no reason to believe that he's punishing me for something. Like, look, I'm an honest guy. If I had some darkness in my life, I would tell you, but I can't put my finger on it, right? And they're like, oh, you're lying. So those guys are no help. But anyway, in Job 4:6, they say to him, should not your piety be your confidence and your blameless ways your hope? Just think about the question for a minute. Should not your piety be your confidence and your blameless ways your hope? And here's what I want to say to that. No, absolutely not. But the reason the question is so significant is because it's exactly what we do. We say to God, I'm a good guy. I'm a church-going guy. I've never done the bad stuff. Why is this happening to me? In other words, we do make our piety our confidence. We do bargain with God and say, hey, I've served you. I've done the right stuff. What did I do to deserve this? This is no fair. Why is this happening to me? We use this kind of piety as a bargaining chip, which in a sense says we have made our piety the reason we think we deserve better. In other words, we've put our trust in our piety. And here's where the narrative begins to grow in significance. Because what you're going to see happening with Job is his friends are pious windbags, and they keep basically telling him, put your trust in your piety. What Job does throughout the story is he puts his trust in God. And the difference is massive. And there are millions of people going to church every Sunday in the world who are doing the best they can with everything they've been taught, but what they've been taught is to put your trust in your piety and not put your trust in God. And the difference is a Grand Canyon chasm of size. And they say to him, shouldn't you put your trust in your piety? And he doesn't. And as the journey unfolds, it becomes very clear that his trust is in God. All right. In Job 9, Job is struggling with the pain, as we all would. And he's speaking of God in the highness of who God is. And he says, he's not a mere mortal like me that I might answer him, that we might confront each other in court. In other words, my protest to God, I can't just say, hey, buddy, show up. We're going to duke this out. This is God. And this is part of the beauty of Job. He's like, this is God we're talking about. It's part of his trouble and his pain, but it's also part of the beauty of his faith. And the thing to me about Job is, it is a story of the victory of a towering faith. And that's where I find so much beauty in it. Suffering will press your faith and want to crush it. And many of us in the face of suffering will chuck it. And Job doesn't. And one of the reasons is because he hasn't put his confidence in his piety, like his friends who are a complete pain in the neck. He puts his confidence in God. Even though he struggles with God, why is this happening? Why is this happening? But he keeps dealing with God and not placebos. Okay, so look at what he says in 33. If only there were someone to mediate between us, someone to bring us together, someone to remove God's rod from me so that his terror would frighten me no more. Then I would speak up without fear of him. But as it now stands with me, I cannot. What Job is saying is, me, human, sinful, broken, fallen, God high, lifted up, and perfect, I can't do it with him. I need a mediator. And here's where you just read these verses and you're like, it's as though Job was saying, if only there were Jesus to mediate between us, someone to bring us together, someone who is God and man, someone who can stand in the gap of this distance of character and holiness and being. It's like he's pleading for Jesus before Jesus has come on the scene or before he would know about it. And this is like so beautiful because we can get into some abstract questions later on, but like I think when Job meets Jesus, he's like, you're the one I was talking about. You're the one I was pleading for. Okay, beautiful, powerful. Job 13:15. To me, the greatest statement of faith I've ever heard. Job speaking about God in the struggle, in the darkness, and what he ultimately says is, even if God slays me, I will hope in him. Sometimes at the end of the end of the end of the end of the day, you got to decide where your chips lie. Are they going to be in me? Are they going to be in me what I think I deserve? Are they going to be in my confidence in my piety or my personhood? And what Job ultimately says is, if he takes my life, I'll still trust him. Because ultimately my chips are in him. They're not in me. My trust is in him, not in me. And of course, the reason it's such a towering story of faith is that he says that in the midst of such incredible pain. It's remarkable. I could go on and on about it. All right. Now here we go to Job 19. I've only got a couple more. So we go to Job 19 in the struggle, and here's what Job says. Again, this guy is like my hero. He says, I know that my Redeemer lives. In the midst of his pain, he's saying this. I know that my Redeemer lives and that in the end he will stand on the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, after I die and my body decays, yet in my flesh I will see God. He somehow has a little tiny mustard seed of resurrection theology here. What he's saying, it's not a robust resurrection, fully laid out story, but he's got the kernels of resurrection theology. And he says, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see with my own eyes, I and not another, how my heart yearns within me. Just incredible faith. Okay, in Job 42, this is following Job 38:9, little break in 40, and then 40:41. where you get to what really is sort of the courtroom scene. And Job has been laying it out with God. He's been expressing his anger with God. And God is tough on him. Okay, now we can say, I don't like that God was tough on him. Okay, we all have to wrestle with this. But I don't like a God who's a pushover either. I don't have all the answers to help parse that all out. But God is tough on him. And in Job 38:9, 40, he says things like, Job, so all these questions you've got, tell me, what do you know about who put the stars in the sky, Job? And who put the waters in the ocean and told it how far it can go, Job? And he goes on and on and on and on. And it's kind of like, right? And finally, Job is like, uncle, okay, all right. God is tough with him. All right, but then Job comes to this place and he says, I know that you can do all things. This is his confession after God has been strongly speaking to him. I know you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You asked, speaking of Job, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? What a statement. This is what God says to Job. Who is obscuring my plans without knowledge? In other words, you know nothing and you are challenging me? Okay, some of you have had moments like that with your teenagers, apparently, occasionally. That's what parenthood is like. You know nothing about what you're talking about, but you are certain that you will protest with every ounce of vigor that you've got. Okay, so Job says, this is his confession. Surely I spoke of things I didn't understand, things too wonderful for me to know. This is like your teenager coming back to you when they're 20 and they say, I'm really sorry. I thought I knew, but now I know that I didn't know. You said, listen now and I'll speak. I'll question you and you shall answer me. And then Job says, my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. The statements in the book of Job that are faith expressions and the articulations are just magnificent. He says, look, I wouldn't have known this without my suffering because I had a lot of religion. I had piety. I was doing all the right stuff. But now that I've been through this crucible, what I know is I know that religion was a matter of what I had heard with my ears. It wasn't a personal knowing of you. And suffering will either vastly deepen our personal relationship with God or it will tend to make us turn away. And part of the beauty of Job is the victory of faith as he comes to God, and he basically says, my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. And I want to say to Job, okay, well, will you go back and talk to your friends and tell them that you guys think you know what you're talking about, but you know what you're talking about? I'm still angry at those guys, and they lived about 1400, BC. Okay. And then finally, the sort of reconciling at the end of Job is Job 42. The Lord blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the former part. He had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 donkeys. That's a lot. So we've moved through really the history content. When you're going through Samuel and Kings and Chronicles, and to me, it is the harder stuff to teach. It just doesn't have as much meaty, teachable, poetic, all that. But it is essential to understand the trials and tribulations of the people of Israel as they are maturing to become God's people. Okay. 5-minute break.